Okay, so we're recording. This is the fourth reading group, and our topic today is centralization versus decentralization. I said I would moderate it, but I also felt like and heard from folks that people are really interested in the core reading that we did. So hopefully people feel really excited to jump in as needed, or maybe because I'm a little frazzled today. So what we usually do is go around and do intros, and it's sort of a brief name or screen name, plus also maybe where you're based or like why you come to be here today. And I'll just call people's names in the order that I see them to kind of just help manage that intro process. And I'll start with an intro for myself and then name a few folks. So I'm Dawn. I come kind of to Data Together through EDGI, or Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. And I'm based here in Toronto at the Faculty of Information, where I'm also a PhD student. So the next people I see are Rico and Song.
Great. I'll go next. My name is Rico Gardafe. I am based in Brooklyn, New York. And I turn myself up? Oh, sorry. Can't hear me. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York, and I work alongside Brendan O'Brien at Query.
Song, I see your lips moving, but there's no audio coming.
Yeah,
from
it looks
you.
like your audio.
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Song. I am based in New Zealand, but I work with Jeremy, who's based in Boston, and we work on a research nonprofit studying the internet.
Awesome. So the next person I see is Jack, and then Eric.
My name's Jack. I work with Dawn as a PhD student at Faculty of Information at University of Toronto, and I'm doing research about sort of values and design, focusing on a decentralized social web project. So that's my interest for this group.
Hi everybody, my name is Eric Nost. I teach at the University of Guelph in Canada, and I come to Data Together through EDGI. So I'm very interested in environmental applications and dimensions of data governance, digital governance, and different technologies, web technology.
Awesome. So the next people I see are Michelle and Brendan.
Hi, I'm Michelle Brous. I'm based out of San Francisco, and I came to Data Together through work with Protocol Labs.
And my name's Brendan O'Brien. I came to Data Together via EDGI and Query, which is a project that I'm a part of. And yeah, I'm super pumped for today's topic. It's gonna be really good.
So the next people I see are Environmental Data, G, ellipses, and Matt Zed.
Sorry, I must have not logged out as this from last time. I'm Matt Price. I am at University of Toronto. I teach digital humanities and history, and I come to Data Together through EDGI, like Don and a couple others here.
Matt Zamwa. I'm at Protocol Labs. I work on projects like IPFS and libp2p. I did not get to read the Schneider article. I was too busy this week, so I'm just listening in this time.
The next people I see are David AD and Rob.
Hi, I'm Davidad. I am based in Nevada, and I am here through Protocol Labs. I'm working on sort of future developments in IPLD, and I'm also just have a side interest in meta research, and a lot of this seems like super relevant background for that. So I'm happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Rob. I am in San Francisco, and I work on some of the web monitoring software tools for Edgy.
And last, I see Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy. I work with Sung. I'm in Boston at the moment, and we're still a research nonprofit and still interested in the internet.
Awesome. This is so great. So just also maybe a bit of background for folks. This is a bit of a tight turnaround from our last reading group. So we decided to sort of try and focus on the one core reading, which was Nathan Schneider's The Irresistible Power of Decentralization and Its Elusiveness. But also to kind of supplement that, had a shorter, just the executive summary of a much longer MIT report that maybe some of you are already familiar with that came out last year, and then two kind of like primers around federation and peer-to-peer, one from the Network Cultures Organization and the other from the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. And so I and others have been adding some themes that kind of maybe came up to us in the readings. And so before we go through some of the ones that I put, I was wondering if we wanted to go around and people wanted to maybe sort of surface some things they want to make sure we talk about today. So we have like an hour and 20 minutes. And there's sort of an arc that we can go through with that, but we can keep adding some more questions now of things we want to make sure we talk about. So I'm just going to read the couple that got added, not by me first, into this questions thing, and then sort of open it up for others. So one is, there's a gem near the beginning of, I'm assuming the main piece, and so someone wanted to hear how it accords with the experience of those who have been more involved in some of these conversations, maybe. And it's a quote, very quotable. I feel like also I did a lot of grabbing like quotes from that article that I just want to like throw out there and hear what people think about it. So it seems like many of the Bitcoin folks are trapped in some horrible play where everyone has to use the word decentralized to mean different things. Yeah, so maybe before we get immediate reactions, if there are any other questions or things that people were struck by that they want to kind of hear feedback from others, we could do that now. And I'll keep stack, but also you can probably just jump in if it's if there's a little bit of a lull. Go ahead, Matt P.
I want to be sure to talk about means and ends in Schneider, where he makes the claim that decentralization becomes its own an end in itself in this conversation for a couple of complicated of reasons that I think are somewhat nuanced. And I want us to interrogate our own motivations, but also to evaluate that claim.
Great, thanks. Was that a hand, B5?
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read through the themes that have already been mentioned, so I apologize if I double up. But I really like this sort of like proposed conclusion of the Schneider article, talking about this this pivot toward how do I make everything more accountable. And I just love to sort of like see if we could investigate that framework and what I'd love to just hear what others think about that accountability framing.
Maybe I'll just start mentioning the themes I had and see if that stirs up anything else. And actually one of the ones I drew upon was similar to that, Brendan, so I do hope we talk about it. And I was actually trying to maybe draw a line across from, I might mispronounce their last name, but Barabas in the MIT report. There's sort of this view gets put forward that like, maybe consolidation is inevitable and that might not necessarily be a bad thing. And sort of thinking about how Schneider also talks about like, maybe we need more accountable centralizations. So I thought that might be definitely a space to spend some time. One of the other ones I drew on up at the top was kind of, and maybe this goes a little bit to what Matt Price was saying, do people see themselves like using decentralization as an ambiguous term? I think there was a lot of ways it was referred to, either like a floating signifier, potent ideology, sort of a play on that ambiguity, or do they kind of disagree with that's how it's being used? That was kind of one to maybe start from. Another one was, I think, oh, and there's this note about means and ends in the theme that I think Matt Price brought in, but then also, what do people sort of make of this claim of like, if you're seeking to decentralize something, maybe you should be prepared to know how to centralize it as well. So I think that kind of maybe asks what the accountabilities have to look like on the other end. And then, I mean, I wasn't sure, this was me just trying to like bring everything together, but was wondering if we wanted to sort of think about the relationship between how decentralized, federated, and these like open protocol things are like technically implemented, but then also like the desire for them, and spend some time kind of like trying to untangle that. And then my like sub question was, is a decentralized web even possible? Or further, is it even desirable? Because I feel like that kind of was maybe hovering in the background. And then I think one of the last ones was this notion of like, I think that brought up in the MIT report was maybe should we understand it as what the preconditions for success of these new projects have to be? And there was 3 or 4 that were put forward in the MIT report of user-controlled data, ownership of a social graph, and intellectual property created online. I feel like I'm just like blowing through, but I'll say this last theme and then maybe we can sort of circle back and spend some time together. But the last one that has been totally in my mind was this notion of like, is there sort of this way that we're kind of trying to use, like, is there like a purity hovering in the background of like, everything has to be decentralized and only fully decentralized? And so like, I think this notion of like hybrid forms kind of was very briefly mentioned in Schneider's piece, but that came out a little bit in kind of just thinking about federated structures. So now that I've said a lot of words, do other people have immediate themes that they want to kind of surface before we begin? Or maybe we could turn kind of to that opening question about this sort of, everyone has to use the word decentralized and it means different things, because I think that'll kind of be the most productive space for people's thoughts from the reading. Go.
I think the one thing that stood out to me, largely because I'm coming at this from interest in values, was in the Schneider piece. On page 12, he writes that decentralization has spurred a kind of moral theory as well, and a kind of piety. And I'm interested in if this is a moral theory, then where are the conflict? Where are the moral struggles, the decisions between good or evil, or doing something morally right or wrong? And I think just based on what Don has just been reviewing, I guess that to me, I guess Schneider concludes by talking about accountability. That seems like a much more morally defensible position than decentralization in itself. So I'm interested in how, like, what I could see, being accountable is a moral good in a way that being decentralized or centralized doesn't seem inherently good or bad to me. But I guess that's sort of where I'm interested in, is that moral aspect of this and how that fits into how we talk about it.
Go B5.
I'm trying to leave room for others who maybe haven't spoken as much to like get a chance to jump in, but I'm also going to try and keep the ball rolling because Jack, what you were saying is very stimulating, because I think that for me the accountability thing is nice, where he sort of identifies these 2 main circles of like political decentralization and then technical decentralization, and sort of mapping how like I think he does a really great job of calling out, or Schneider does a great job of calling out which how the technical side intentionally leaves it a little more messy, and the political side sort of kind of pulls these 3 main buckets and things more or less consistent. I mean, that's a bit summative, but I'm not a political scientist. And I think I wonder about how the accountability framing sort of, is it shoehorning it to sort of say that is an attempt to unify the two in a sense, like to sort of make it a smaller footprint that is, as you said, more defensible. To me, I think that's interesting, but maybe that's overly summative. Yeah, and I'd also like to just wonder about like what would the notion of accountability in practice look like on both of these sides. Like, obviously, we have the notion of government accountability. That's something that is obvious on the face of it, but in practice becomes very interesting. And then same thing from the tech side. Like, what does it mean to make accountable decentralized technology? How does that function? And that would be a totally different metric than our usual, like, oh, the unit test passed and the performance is incredible and it maintains 700 multiple connections. Like, that's it's a different set of metrics.
Yeah, go Matt Price.
I think this. I think one of the reasons for dividing the two categories, the technical and the political, is first that they have separate lineages to some extent, but also that especially in the tech side. Sorry, there's the cat. We may have a kind of an unacknowledged tendency to raise decentralization up as its own virtue, right? And what we're doing, because of the sort of polyvalence of the term that he describes, what we're doing is loading that word decentralization. We're making it carry the weight of a range of, ideological or political virtues that we think it carries. And it's a useful tool for that because it means different things to different people. And so people associate different virtues with decentralization. And so we can garner allies who we might not actually be allied with ideologically, because we're using the same word to describe these different virtues that we're striving for. And that's useful tactically, but strategically, it means that we may never actually have articulated the ideological goods that actually matter to us. And we may also find, after a struggle for decentralization, that we haven't accomplished any of the goods that really matter to us, and we may become kind of enthralled to our own concepts, so that we end up pursuing goals without the process, the moment of reflection that's really required to meet the goals that we actually have. Something like that.
Maybe I'll just jump on that and sort of go back to, or like extend what you said and sort of agree that I was really convinced. I was actually kind of convinced by why it's maybe sometimes a good thing to have a term that I think this notion of like obscures contradictions temporarily, but then figuring out how to have that snap back seemed kind of like a way forward. And maybe accountability as like a concept is part of proposing that. I mean, I felt like there was a lot of like sort of ways of thinking about how you would do that in practice in these spaces that were kind of suggested in the paper. But I kind of, was just really stuck muddling through like why sometimes you want to or not accidentally, it's like you want to have enough space to sort of be on side with people that you might not regularly find an affinity with. And that's kind of like the power of these like attractor kind of words, like maybe decentralization is right now, or I feel like data is kind of that in academia. Like just throw data on something and everyone will get excited and show up for a conference, which makes me think of that Portlandia Put a Bird on It sketch. So in my head, I'm like, put decentralization on it, put data on it. So maybe like to just go back to the first question that Matt P raised about kind of like means versus ends. Is there a way that we kind of want to thicken or just spend some time talking about like how decentralization operates as a means, or how decentralization kind of exists as people talk about it now as an end? Go, Matt Zed.
Well, one of the things that keeps coming up for me is that preconditions for success that that Barabbas proposes, and it's so weird. A shift towards user-controlled data, the ownership of a user's social graph, and her intellectual property created online. And so I didn't get a chance to read her article, so I don't know the context of that quote. For me, it's in that puzzle. If you talk about means and ends, is that the ends that a lot of us are orienting towards, or is that a means? And if it's a means, then what's it a means towards? I'll just like speak from my own. I think that a healthier economy is one where as many actors as possible have agency over their participation in that economy, and so creating the right infrastructure that achieves that maximization and protects it is sort of what motivates me. So like coming back to the question posed, I think we don't spend enough time talking specifically about what is the end, what are the ends that we're actually trying to orient towards. So I'm trying to like throw that in there as mine, or one of mine.
Can I just we used to in Berlin raise two hands if our point was to the point. I didn't quite. I wonder if you can clarify what you mean by where participants have control over the economy, because I think that's not trivial to define.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just use a loaded term. That might make it worse or better. It's about enfranchisement, right? It's about who gets to act as an agent within the economy and have ownership of their own property, and to have the ability to make decisions about how it will be exchanged and to profit from the value that's created by their work, right? And so yeah, that hits into all of the interesting thing is that hits into this like giant minefield of like what's the value of labor and capitalism versus alternative models, and it goes into that whole space, which I think is sort of sitting there assumed in a lot of the discussions around decentralization without people actually grappling with it and realizing that actually we all have lots of different ideas on this stuff, and it's hard to parse. And so the I don't know if that clarified it all. Matt, did that answer your question?
I think it made it harder, but it also a little bit more specific.
Right.
Maybe one of the choice quotes from the peer-to-peer definition that I'll offer here, but we don't really have to spend too much time on, was this, and I'm gonna say their name wrong, but I think one of the main people who's been driving a lot of the early work from there is, I think it's Michelle Bowens, but introduced this notion of equipotency. I don't know if anyone got that far in the weeds, but I was there. So equipotency of participants, and it was this notion of like free cooperation of equals in the view of performing a common task for creation of a common good, with forms of decision making and autonomy that are widely distributed, which kind of felt like this sort of very technical way of trying to like anchor I think some similar themes to what you're speaking to, Matt. Zed, I don't know if I agree worked, but we got a new word for it if we want it.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, what she's saying sounds, it sounds a little bit utopian. Where another way I have spoken about this would be is about ownership of the means of production and the means of distribution, and so if you have a scenario where a small number of people own the means of production, and because they own the means of production, they also by default own the work product, that opens the door to all sorts of forms of exploitation where people don't have control over the products of their labor. And so to change the infrastructure so that by default, like everyone can actually own the means and actually have control over the means of production of the value, which is in this case, an information economy, the creation of information and creation of data, or recontextualization or transformation of data, that's something that everyone can participate in that and have some ownership of not only the work product, but also the means of production. And I'll step back. I took 3 stabs.
We appreciate it. I think I saw Rico's hand and then Matt P after.
Yeah, coming from that idea that Matt kind of walked us through, my sort of takeaway was a kind of warning for anybody who considers centralization to be the end or the ultimate goal. And what they ought to keep in mind is that in so many different instances in our history, even in situations where power was distributed evenly or people felt agency or took an interest in exercising it, some neat tool came along, and it was kind of written or unwritten social contract where people traded away that agency for some kind of collective efficiency. So it's so easy to trade away your decentralized agency and your power for some efficiency. So it's cool that I'm an equal part of this team or group, but I might trade away my vote in order to have it well run by somebody. So that's why I elect a representative. And so there's so many different instances where we gravitate towards re-centralization because it gives us something that we're willing to trade away our power for. So I think decentralization decentralization is your end or your goal, then individual empowerment, not just empowerment, but agency and interest in exercising that power has to be really core with every node on the decentralized network, or you're going to see some elements where it gravitates back towards some kind of re-centralization.
Did you want to go, Matt P?
Well, I'm pretty interested to hear from other people, and I feel like I'm talking too much. However, there are a lot of things that have come up from these last couple of points that I'm interested in. I don't really know that much about Bitcoin. Probably everybody on the call knows more than I do about Bitcoin. For me, I thought that Schneider's account of centralizing tendencies within Bitcoin was really convincing. That there are, in principle, everybody has the ability to mine Bitcoin. In practice, Bitcoin mining, there's that fantastic image from the conference where 90% of the Bitcoin mining power is on the stage at the same time. That's amazing, when this is a multi-billion-dollar economy, if I'm getting that right. So I think it's interesting to shift the focus the way Schneider is suggesting that we do, and think about like the ways in which what looks like decentralization in one domain can become centralization in another domain. And if you're attending just to the narrow technical context, you might miss the ways. To me, Bitcoin feels like a disaster. Like it's a catastrophe. And a lot of people who participate in it have a notion that they're kind of saving the world from something. And that might be in part because of a narrow technical focus. And then I was just thinking of when Rico was talking, it seemed that was a very rich comment, I thought. And it seems like there are lots of different domains where you can think about the trading away of autonomy that we participate in. I mean, this is what Hobbes says we did at the beginning of time, basically, right? That we made this trade of freedom for security. And whether or not you believe that anybody actually entered into a contract at the beginning of time, there's something resonant in that, and there's something about like that. If you think of the Marxian view of the development of capital in the 18th and 19th centuries, there's a kind of trading of individual autonomy for efficiencies. You know, it's not undertaken of one's free will, but it's a kind of dynamic that's in Marx's view intrinsic to the development of the forces of production. So anyway, that's me talking a lot. I saw Sung and Davidad had both had their hands up, I thought.
Yeah, I'm really interested by the idea that decentralized networks tend towards centralization naturally, and it reminds me of our previous talk about commons and how we talked about how there's a sort of paradox where at the same time as things like the internet both beginning and sort of decentralized networks, they tend towards centralization and monopolies, and that the market in general tends towards monopolies. And in a sort of similar way where neoliberal economies at the same time as pushing towards that also tends towards a centralizing technocracy, even in the way it influences the public sectors in terms of how they push for that decentralized bottom-up reporting back the progress and profits that even the public sectors made to the centralized governmental agencies, or the sort of more so that example I'm thinking of is the New Zealand health sector, where they've got the district health centres that the hospitals report back to, but at the same time as doing this, the policy decisions were pushed back down to the hospitals through the sort of centralized networks, and so in Schneider's article, he mentions how there's this American impulse or longing towards decentralization, because they're like really skeptical about big governments controlling you and things like that. But at the same time, that exact decentralization, which is meant to free you, ends up worsening inequalities and worsening things in such a way that the real power becomes more focused in the hands of fewer people, and so I wonder whether again, I think it's in the Schneider article as well, whether our conceptions of what an individual is and what that individual's freedom and the distribution of the networks made up of individuals is what's confusing our definition of decentralization and centralization, and why it keeps kind of implicitly attracting like connotations of virtue as related to things like things that we take to be democratic. So that was kind of a ramble, but that was my take on it.
I had a couple brief points to make. One is pointing out from that long definition of peer-to-peer that Don read out, peer-to-peer is a form of relational dynamic based on the assumed equipotency of the participants. And I think that assumption is a lot of the ways that you can sweep under the rug these things like actually you're going to end up concentrating power in the hands of the few. It's like it would have worked if participants remained equipotent and were equipotent now and were for the rest of time. But like the other point I wanted to make was an example of people trading away their decentralized chunk of power for efficiency is joining a mining pool, where you're trading away your actual authority to check transactions, and in exchange you're getting some insurance, like you're spreading out the risk that you might not win the lottery every time. So it's sort of like an insurance scheme, and insurance schemes are also sort of centralizing forces, Lloyd's of London and things like that. So that's my bit.
Jeremy?
I just wanted to add on to the general suggestions from Matt Z and Matt P before about talking. So basically, there is the difficulty of trying to figure out what is actually a public good when talking about why a model of a network should operate differently from some centralizing platform. And to me, it seems like almost everything that you could offer is mired in just inherent fuzziness, because it comes down to terminal value judgments about all kinds of very deeply nested forms of rhetoric, other than simple things like information content. So I've been thinking a lot about how the critiques folk vernacular critiques of the tech industry, many of them seem to be about one fairly basic thing, which is the notion that tech fetishizes creative destruction for seemingly no purpose other than that the person who is now the stakeholder in the new thing that has supplanted the old thing wouldn't have been on the ground floor of the old thing. And so they simply replaced the old thing without adding new modalities, that new affordances. They said, Uber but for dogs, or X but for Y. And to me, it seems like a fairly robust indicator of whether value has been added over time is, was anything novel actually achieved in the result of this supplanting of the old with the new, in the same sense that a new social app that doesn't pay any mind to whether it's woke or decentralized or anything like that, users won't use it if it doesn't do something new for them. And a lot of decentralization-oriented projects, they have this notion that if they are a feature-for-feature competitor to something that is already in use, that the fanaticism will drive the rest of it, that will be a value added on top, the political aims, where if you have an app like Musical.ly, it added music to Vine. If you had an app like Vine, it added these short little web clips to something like Snapchat. And so there are these clear patterns of, if you look at these things as creatively destructive forces in themselves, these new apps, these new social use cases that people are chasing, where they're just trying to turn a profit, they're trying to make a new popular social network, you see that they do understand that they need to have a hook. They need to have the thing that really is a differentiator. And in a lot of decentralization rhetoric, it enshrouds the entire project in a sense that there is no need for that, except that it's not someone else that you dislike already. It's not Jack of Twitter who is controlling your tweets. It's some unnamed admin of a Mastodon server. And it really seems like it's quite simple to me if you get down to brass tacks about whether over the course of, if you look in the secular view of 10, 20 years, was their value added on top in terms of what affordances were added? Was informational continuity preserved? Were the desires of the users actually enacted in a longer term, more robust way than they otherwise would have been? And so I can't really say that a user is less autonomous on, for instance, Google Drive than a Nextcloud server that's going to go up in smoke next year, but they don't know that yet. If it means that 10 years from now, they still have their document that they wrote 10 years ago on Google Drive. I can't really convince myself that they are less autonomous because Google was able to data mine them. They have their stuff. And for me, that seems fairly fundamental.
I'll say two really small things, and then actually think maybe we could have Eric, if you'd like, expand on your point, because I think that was a really interesting thread that came up in Schneider's article that we haven't addressed yet. But kind of, Jeremy, to what you said, and to sort of the comments before, I think that that this notion of the relationship of the individual to collective action and how that maybe takes a state form, I think was sort of kind of a big part of a slightly preemptory conversation I had with Jack just before this call. Sorry, we cheated. And kind of, I think Jack said this, which really stuck with me, is there's a way that maybe if in a rhetoric of decentralization, it's all about eliminating institutions, that kind of misplaces that what it should be thinking about is at what scale do these new institutions operate, or or reform of existing institutions, and that maybe is a way of, and something that came out of our discussion of the Commons in Ostrom last week that could kind of give us some handholds to think about what accountability looks like, both in new projects that are being built. So we're thinking about creating our own institutions, but then also accountability in existing spaces. So maybe reform of institutions. So I'll just say those little bits, but then one part also of that conversation that goes to what Jeremy just said, which is yeah, I think there's a lot there, but what I'm kind of stuck with is and I agree to your point that this sort of feature to feature recreation of a decentralized version of a thing, and if we're trying to think about what a thing actually achieves, so maybe the goal of whatever the centralized platform was to do X, but there also end up being these platforms or spaces where so much more things are happening on it that and or the ways that trust is negotiated, or how it is those spaces are maintained, that I think whatever a different decentralized version of that might look like would maybe have very few comparable features. There could be a lot of other things about relations of trust, or how people operate as some a group in that space that kind of recreate some form of similar outcome. And we were using the conversation earlier of how certain communities, including refugee communities, use Facebook, and maybe the way they're getting scammed, but then protected by those scams because of Facebook moderation. And what would a decentralized version that didn't use Facebook look like? And it might not mean that it involves a heavy amount of third-party moderation, right? It might be these relations of peers and trust ways that you know someone who knows someone, and vetting or something, I've just made that far more mechanical than it needed to be. But great points. And Brendan, unless you have an immediate response, I was wondering if I could slightly put Eric on the spot and or ask you to speak more to your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. I think have maybe three quick things to say, and the last one is really just echoing what you just said about trust, Don. So we'll see. But yeah, I mean, I just think that, going back to the conversation about decentralization and centralization, I just found that paragraph, really that section in Schneider on protocols, really illuminating to think about how some of the bigger questions around segmenting out decentralization, right? You can decentralize access and networks, but then also re-centralize other parts of your program, of your technology, through protocols, through other means. I thought that was really illuminating. And then the second point I wanted to bring up was around this conversation about equipotency, and which also I think has to do with means and ends, which is that another really powerful quote for me in Schneider was on page 26, around people coming to platforms, to projects with diverse capacities and opportunities, and how re-centralization occurs through inequalities that are actually external to any platform per se. And so it just got me thinking a lot about, I think the term external comes up in some of the other readings too, but it's like users bring all sorts of, they bring their whole lives to whatever they're doing, participating, using whatever platform. And so, accounting for that in some ways seems really important. And it seems to me that this question of like means and income comes up in that, like, a platform that doesn't in some way address that or seek to in turn reduce inequalities that are generated external to it may ultimately reinforce them. So that's something that I am trying to think through. And the third point was just around, trust. I think that was a really key term that came up in the section around accountability, and echoed a lot of stuff I've been hearing lately. And so I'd be curious to hear more on what you all think about, like, trustless versus trust-based systems, and what role they play here.
So, Brendan, I think you're on Stack, and I think I might have missed a hand.
I think Metzi jumped on the Stack, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't miss hand. Eric, to like build onto your point, I think, I'd sort of like highlight something that might be orthodox to this discussion, but it might be part of this discussion, is this sort of like using words like central is really difficult in this conversation. But this this tension that you sort of feel that I don't feel like we acknowledge enough, which is just that the current internet is quite mature. And so to Jeremy's point about like needing to somehow make some sort of progress, some sort of feature offering over our existing set of services. I think we feel this tension a lot in the decentralized space. We need to not only provide feature parity, but then we have to afford some sort of switching costs. I know that like in some of our talking about query, we often talk about this, how like it's not good enough to just do data stuff and be decentralized. It has to do data stuff, be decentralized, and then provide some incentive for you to change over to the other service. One other way of conceiving of that may be that stepping aside from the sort of morality of decentralization or the moral ends of it, but the sort of means on the technical side, where we have decentralization as a set of tools and as a set of protocols that do demand that you submit to them, but also really open up new modalities of thought and new styles of interaction that are separate and apart from the like notion of improving upon existing user models. But to even get there, we have the tension of the existing robust, modern, mature internet that sort of provides why wouldn't I just use Twitter, right? Like, to Mastodon for the pure virtue of decentralization. And Jeremy, I think you raise a lot of really interesting points about like, who am I really exchanging this for? But the notion of like, if you address that with like SSB, Secure Subtle Web, which like has this very different and very much embraces this like, embraces this like decentralized, like ephemeral, not have the entire picture. You never have the entire network. And that is a feature, that is not a bug, right? And that, but then now you have like a new marketing problem, right? Like not marketing problem, but like, for whom is that valuable, and for whom is that an exciting sort of place where they can grow, where it's scratching a niche that wasn't being scratched before? And so I just want to sort of like highlight that tension where like we have this odd burden of standing in the existence of the current internet infrastructure and it being decentralized to a lot of people's sort of perspective. And I think that if you bring the Bitcoin thing into this, like the economic incentives of that really drove that pendulum swing very quickly. $60 billion is a great reason for anybody involved, and including a bank, including a lot of people. Anyways, that's a bit of a ramble, but I just want to sort of highlight that because I think there's some like interplay there that maybe needs to be pulled apart.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe Matt Zed, I think you're on Stack.
Yeah, and I think this also lets us pivot to the thing that Matt P, also known as environmental data ... just said we hopes we get to. Partially echoing what Jeremy said, or I like this usage of the term affordances and talking about evaluating different systems that in terms of what are the affordances, okay, if that's a densely packed term, what are the things that it allows people to do, and what are the activities that it constrains, and who is encouraged or constrained in those ways, and asking that of these systems, I think is a nice way to frame it. And that's paired with something that Don then talked about. You mentioned scale, right? So it's the scale of what is the scale of the system that's operating, but also what's the scale of power that's wielded by someone who's running, who's an individual. That comes to Matt P's thing. One of these individuals, what's the scale of their power by being one of the people running within the system, right? And that's where I often reach for the metaphor. One of the metaphors I reach for is the printing press, right? So you create the ability to, you design the printing press and you make it possible to build and operate a printing press. And then now that knowledge is out there, right? And in its first deployment, you'll have a small number of people who can build printing presses and run them. But the knowledge of how to build another one is already out there. And so like designing a system that is permissionless in that way, that the knowledge is out there and the knowledge of how to rebuild the system from scratch is out there. The challenge in using that metaphor is that printing presses are just a means of production, whereas protocols, like these technologies we're talking about, are a means of production and a means of distribution. And so that's where the sort of politics and the economics get more complicated. But I often, in the work that I do, aim to be saying anyone should be able to build their own node. They should be able to like pick up one of these protocols and run it themselves and completely reimagine how you could use that protocol. And that's why I'm less interested in your sort of logically centralized blockchain things, because in order to participate in those, you're joining this giant pool. So it's a scale thing. So if you have 100 million people relying on it, now you're jumping into this gigantic pool rather than being able to say, like with Scuttlebutt, I'm going to be running this protocol for 20 people around me. And if that grows to 200, great. And if it doesn't, that's great too. Like it serves who it serves. And so yeah, and that's where this language of affordances, I think, is a great way to tease that apart. Of why is that inspiring to me versus other things? And I want to like take that with me and ponder it. But then if we could then pivot to Matt, I guess after Brendan, or was Matt next? All right. Yeah.
I was just going to respond to that analogy because, of course, you know, in the 16th century, Gutenberg looks like a highly decentralized technology. In the 19th century, printing is already a fairly centralized, endeavor. And by the early 20th, totally, radically centralized. So what's going on there? are we talking about a technical imperative or some kind of, and this is what I think Schneider is implying, there's some kind of centralizing tendency that's related maybe just to the kind of society that we live in, you know, which has a state at the center. Or maybe, you know, maybe it's about the dynamics of markets when not, you know, subject to regulation or whatever. It's hard to know exactly what he thinks is, you know, whether it's a kind of intrinsic thing or what. You know, I often think about the role of the mimeograph machine in the civil rights movement. So like in the Birmingham bus boycott, the flyers about the boycott were printed up in the middle of the night in the high school where Black women worked as secretarial staff. So like they kind of basically broke into work and ran off a bunch of copies. It was essential. It was like a really important decentralized technology. So like I believe in some ways in the power of these tools to affect, to transform social possibilities. But I've lived now through more than one purported revolution, which I believed in, which didn't happen. And you know, I think Schneider is cautioning us to control our enthusiasm, to curb our enthusiasm for the technical developments that we're engaged with.
So maybe just looking at the amount of time we have left, I think that was a great response, and there's also kind of the thing, Matt Price, that you said you also want to make sure we come back to, which is, I think, Frug, just mispronouncing everyone's name today, apologies. And Davidad, great. And I just wanted to also say, if other people haven't said anything or maybe mentioned something in this conversation, if there's something we haven't addressed that you'd like to speak to, this might be a time. But maybe I'll turn it over to Davidad now, and then we can do that and then go back to this notion of individuals and this sort of autonomous self.
Yes, the comment about Gutenberg being decentralizing when it came out and then it evolved into something centralizing, I do think that's a common pattern. And the way that I make sense of that is that when a new technology is introduced, it sort of throws society out of equilibrium in that dimension. And when you're in a destabilized, out of equilibrium situation is when small players can get a big edge. And then as the society sort of accustoms to that being the technology, the re-centralizing institutions evolve and you get back to a more stable equilibrium where there are more obvious centers of power.
I feel like there's potentially a future thread here, and I just mentioned in the chat, it's kind of something I think maybe coming out of the master switch might be helpful for us to kind of untangle this more in a future reading group. So yeah, is there, before we turn to this sort of, the thing I'm just going to keep saying about this individualized autonomous self, are there other thoughts that people want to add, especially maybe that haven't been covered today? Okay, so I'm just gonna scroll into that section and hope that maybe someone else is there before me and wants to kind of refocus us on that question about kind of here. I have a quote. I'll say the first sentence of it. It's on page 26. I think this is kind of where you were going, Matt Price. Tell me I'm wrong. That sort of, there's an interesting way, and Frug is drawing on feminist thinkers to propose that you know, what decentralization has done is actually almost like centered this like individuated notion of an individual as autonomous, and that there's a lot of baggage and assumptions that go in there. I think in an earlier point, Schneider points out, you know, how some of this can be expressed in this very like rational game theoretic sort of like language. And so Frug's like counter is that a just decentralization requires presuming decentered, situated participants as opposed to the autonomous, sovereign, centered subject that is that these discourses frequently seem to expect. So maybe Matt P, if you want to unpack a little bit about kind of why you wanted to focus on this, because I have a lot of thoughts coming out of other thinkers that I think would be really cool to read, but I don't know how to succinctly speak to it today.
Well, so, you know, this is a feminist critique from the 1990s, so it's like familiar to me from my education, you know, and it's like, it's the moment when I was being taught all this stuff. And you know, I think it's been rehearsed in a lot of different places, this idea that the kind of patriarchal society envisions a liberal individual who is perfectly autonomous and perfectly independent, and society is merely a conjunction, a union of these individual entities. And we ought to, you know, you see this in Mill, for instance, ground our political theories on these monads, these kind of Leibnizian monads that have a perfect independence. And the feminist critique from that period that I'm familiar with is that actually we live in societies. Who we are is grounded in a set of relationships. And recognizing this also helps us to make sense of and understand and combat certain pernicious forms of oppression, especially for feminists, the kind of the gender system and the constitution of the family. So I feel like I can kind of rehearse that, you know, I can like just say that a bunch of times and I kind of believe it, but I don't quite know what it means to implement a somewhat different idea of what a person is and how to put that at the center of a technological undertaking. I think that there's a whole bunch going on that, like, you know, like say the blockchain discourse is so rooted not just in a vision of a kind of frontier individual, but also in this, you know, kind of radical free marketism, that there are lots of pieces that probably need to be untangled, and it's hard to articulate without more nuanced knowledge than I have what the technical strands might be that you would move in order to kind of focus on a different kind of person or imagine a different kind of person. I don't know. That's what I got.
As usual, it is a gift. So much in there. Yeah, I'll say that I think this is a space that I actually wind up reading in a fair bit, or like people who I think are trying to kind of do what you say, Matt, like draw on that and imagine activating that or what that looks like in how technologies are designed and used. And I don't think that there are like strong models of like, hey, we've been doing it this way for 10 years and this is this thing we got to offer you and this is going to blow your mind. But I think there are a lot of really cool attempts. And like I think about Lucy Suchman's work on located accountabilities, great word, of technology production. Like what I would imagine is actually a few articles that I think have been really active in the space of like offering a lot to think with. And then like I think actually this comes up in EDGI with the Environmental Data Justice Working Group. We kind of look a lot at these like counter mapping examples or other sort of forms of ways that people are trying to visualize data. And that's like sites where people are like really actively holding that in their mind as they do the thing. And so like Kim Fortune's work around that sort of like data repository stuff feels really like high in mind. And I think we've talked about this in Data Together more broadly about like almost wanting to do like design crit style, or like looking through and talking through an app all together with some of these questions. And I guess what I'm saying is maybe part of the problem is like it's hard to get at that question through just thinking. And so maybe that is like you figure out how to do it through also doing, or like in a way that is a little more activated to like the space that you're trying to engage in, which is design, which is also fraud. Basically, I got a lot of readings. That was a ramble. I see Matt dead.
I just think that would be a great topic for a future reading group, especially if there's stuff written that's case studies. I think that's one of the things that's really strong about Ostrom's work, is that she has these great case studies where she describes scenarios of people, here's the problem they were trying to solve and here's how they solved it. And it helps you to reason about these social structures that otherwise just feel really abstract. These intersections of social stuff, economic stuff, etc. So if you know of reading like that, that would be a really cool one.
Guys, add something here. I think the site IndieWeb does some of this. They do basically sort of executive summaries of what different things we're trying to achieve in their design, and they break them down a bit in terms of comparing. So I'll just get the link and paste it in the chat. I'll show.
Can I put Jack on the spot to talk a little bit about IndieWeb?
Anyway, here I am. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm so the project that I'm looking at quite closely for my dissertation is IndieWeb. So and I think that that's one of the things they do quite well, is outline sort of some of the end goals they want. And there's a lot of, well, the website's quite good. I think it's an overview. They have like this extensive wiki with sort of what they want to do, and then very detailed discussions of what they don't want to do often. But I think, sorry, I'm kind of fading because I have not slept well last night, so I'm not as articulate as I might want to be. But I suppose since I've been put on the spot, the one thing that I have been thinking about a lot with IndieWeb is the challenge of scale, because it's I think quite successful at outlining what their goals are in many cases, but has really struggled to gain users beyond this kind of niche, very committed and technically skilled group. And if you go to their website, if you go to indieweb.org/generations, they have this whole concept of, well, we'll have our first generation users who are the people who can build their own content management system, and second generation users might be very heavy social media users who know how to run a WordPress site and are willing to install plugins and all that sort of stuff. And they've barely gotten into generation 2 after several years, which is, I think, quite unfortunate. And I say this not with disdain for, obviously I like IndieWeb quite a bit, but I think a real challenge in doing a good job of outlining goals, there is a challenge in still having that sort of hook. I think a big part of the sell is it's not Facebook, and that is a challenge, like we talked about earlier, trying to have that hook of what does it actually do, and unless you have sort of a fairly high level of technical skill, that might not be immediately apparent, even if amongst that community the priorities and goals are quite clearly articulated.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for letting me put you on the spot. I wonder if anyone else has something kind of in this space. I mean, or something they wanted to bring up to discuss. It sounds like scale has come up a couple times in this conversation, which makes me think that that might be another thing that we want to figure out how to add as a theme for a future conversation. Yeah, and so maybe I'll just look back at some of the earlier themes and see if there isn't anything or something that hasn't been addressed, but if someone has something that was sort of brought to mind from that, Matt Price.
I'm not sure that we've figured out what accountability would look like. You know, so I mean, I think Schneider is amazing, but I don't feel like I really know after reading it how you design accountability into a system, and that might be because there is no recipe. You know, especially if, in order to understand what you're building, you have to look outside the narrow technical confines of the technology anyway. That means that accountability is going to have to be built into the system, not just into the protocol or whatever.
Maybe just to ground that a little bit and then hand it off to BZ and B5 MetZed, a combination of the two of you. I'll say that the four examples that I think were discussed in that last section, which is on page 27, 28, is quite short, are like, some of them are policy, so it's like the role of the WC3C. One is Internet Archive, and the Internet Archive as a model of mission-grounded centralization. They talk about antitrust policy, and then there was, I think, one more. No, that's sort of a counter example of relating Bitcoin to the Federal Reserve. So there isn't a lot that's discussed in that section, and I think it is quite open. But now I will hand off to B5.
I like the idea of BZ as a hybrid thing. Anyways, yeah, I just really want to walk through the set of things that my brain just did that I think are like potentially very erroneous and dangerous when talking about like an accountability thing. It was like, I know how to program. Let's make a protocol, an accountability protocol. It'll be great. Let's see what that looks like in practice. And then you're like, wait, back up. That's the point of the discussion, right? And the realization that the majority of the accountability examples outlined of those four, it's great to have you read them off, Don, because they all felt like they came from the political side of things, where like politics, I think, has more to offer in terms of accountability. I don't know if it's necessarily better. But one sort of thing that I would highlight quite interestingly, considering we have many protocol folks on the call, is like the original IPFS white paper outlines this notion of a BitSwap as a sort of way of being this sort of accountability system for being a good actor in a decentralized sort of block-based storage system, where it was like, hey, I'll keep an internal ledger of reputation of everybody that I see on the network, and then I'll use that as like a mechanism for accounting for the behaviors of others in a peer-to-peer system. And so it was, I think it was actually an attempt to design a protocol that had accountability baked in. There's a lot. I mean, as IPFS has matured, there's been a lot of evolving discussion around this on the technical side that I have delighted in watching. And yeah, and so I think there's like some really interesting inroads that have at least been attempted there. And there's some like really promising and interesting stuff. But also it would be delightful to hear about like how that is or isn't going, or what the sort of side of that is. But just to call that out as like a practical, like I think people are trying to do this practically on the protocol side, and it's just really, it's super daunting, and because it means you have to, like the word smart contract has to be in here somewhere, like this, like, oh, I can easily codify, you know, all of the potential outcomes of anything into code is maybe part of the grinding noises that we're encountering.
Maybe unless
yes, Matt, Ethereum.
Direct response, Jack.
What was that, Don?
It's you, MetZed.
So I was going to say one thing, and then you said that quote, and it made me think of something else. I was basically going to jump in of a lot of people in this cryptocurrency space. There's a little bit of when you have a sledgehammer in your hand, everything looks like something to smash. Of that economic consequences are often treated as the only legitimate accountability. Like you design the protocol so that there are incentives, and then there are also consequences for bad behavior. And that's extremely powerful, so don't underestimate it, but I also think it's a little bit overused, like because it lets you dodge having more nuance of thinking about what consequences could be and what accountability could look like. And that's where the BitSwap one is a good example. A lot of people also reach for trying to create reputation systems, which is, especially if you're saying it's a decentralized reputation system, is that actually even possible, right? As opposed to having reputation be part of the formula of the system, that it arises as an emergent quality of the system. So that's what I was going to jump in. And then you mentioned this quote of like Internet Archive as an example of mission grounded centralization. And I don't know if Internet Archive is, in what ways is it centralized and in what ways is it not? And since today's topic is central, is it like, what do we mean by centralization? There's that sense in which Google search, is that centralized when they're crawling the whole web? And so most people's experience of Google is rewind a couple years, because Google has expanded what they're up to, right? But Google as a search engine, most people's experience of that is I use it to find the things I want and then go engage with it out there in the wide web, right? And so is that a centralized scenario, or is it a decentralized one? And I think the answer is you have a centralized component, the search component, and you have a decentralized component, which is like the content production spread all around. But we often don't dig into that, of the sort of mixed scenario. And I think a lot of us underestimated the danger of just having the search centralized. We're like, oh, well, everyone can create their own websites. So the web as a whole, the infrastructure of the web is safe, right? And we didn't, I certainly like underestimated the ramifications of just the visibility and the flowing of the behavior through a centralized, one central place, sort of has shaken the entire infrastructure.
I guess my really quick comment, sort of in response to Brendan's comments about protocols, sort of what I was thinking is, I guess, another an indie web example is a social media, or a community called micro.blog that is a somewhat decentralized, decentralized sort of microblogging service. However, it also has a hosted version, but quite good interoperability and all of those things. But one of the things that I think has contributed to micro.blog's success is it was created as a Kickstarter, and one of the stretch goals was, the immediate stretch goal was that they would hire a community moderator. And I think that's taken care of a lot of the accountability issues, is there is a human being who is curating many aspects of their discovery, and taking care of that moderation from the get-go, which is not exactly a novel idea if you think about how sort of social websites were run in the 90s, when I think of the kinds of websites I joined then, but is not necessarily something that we immediately think about when we think, oh, well, we can have a protocol take care of accountability. So I was just reminded of that as sort of an alternate way. We can actually still have human beings do this, although that does lead to other sorts of scale issues, of course, because you have to pay those human beings.
Maybe go next song, and then we'll go to Matt Price and sort of do a final call for thoughts and try and weave together towards our next two reading groups. Oh, then Eric.
Yeah. So I was thinking about what Matt P and Matt Z said. Matt P said that there's a particular kind of view of the individual that's driving all this, and it's that atomized monad view of individuals participating. And it made me think about kind of sort of socialist thinkers in the early to late 20th century, like John Dewey and Bookchin, and they talk about individuals as they've got a special way of sort of rethinking individualism as one of their key thoughts. And Dewey talks a lot about the new individual as something to replace the classical liberal view of the individual as the self-sufficient causa sui. It's already there, sort of very artificial, abstract being, to flipping the script to think of the individual as something being developed and produced by the society, in the same way that Bookchin thinks about individualism and individual liberties. And it made me think that in conjunction with the way, so I don't know much about the technical side, but I've read the P2P wiki article, and they were talking about holoptism and anoptism as contrasting concepts against panoptism. And it's very striking because quite often I've seen democracy and political discussions phrased in terms of epistemic concerns about how political information or information is distributed politically. And of course, in talking about P2P and decentralized systems, a lot of it has to be about how information is distributed among the participants and individuals. And I wonder whether shifting our focus from the individuals as characterized by sort of implicit classical liberal assumption, thinking of things with the relationship or the networks as the central units might give us a way out of this.
I sense another theme. I think at this point we're just doing some like serious theme generation, but thank you. Maybe Eric and then Matt Price, and if anyone else is interested also in having a final thought, jump on Stack, and then I'll kind of bring us to a close.
Yeah, just really quickly, this goes back to a thread from a few minutes ago, but another takeaway from the is decentralizing or centralizing as verbs instead of nouns like decentralized or centralized.
Eric, you got really quiet. I think there was a mic adjustment. So I think after the first sentence.
Verbs, not nouns, right? So decentralizing or centralizing. That should be the focus rather than centralized or decentralized, right? So something like, Google has decentralized.
Eric, can you get closer to your mic somehow?
None of us can hear something happened to your mic, so we can't hear
you. Can Eric, I think maybe I had a slightly better mic take, or like I heard, so I'll just try and say a thing that you put a finger on that we didn't discuss today, but goes back to the commons sort of last week, is you talked about, is decentralizing a verb versus a noun? And I think this comes up a lot in the context of commons, which we actually didn't talk about too much because maybe of the readings we selected, but do we want to think about commons as a noun, or do we want to think about the process of decentralizing as something maybe always ongoing? And sort of, I think he drew upon how in this sort of more political take on decentralizing, they're kind of really framing it as that verb, whereas they're not sort of presenting it as a noun. But please add more, but that was, I think where you're going, and you're right, and we did not talk about it enough. But I guess there's never enough time for us to talk about stuff, yet we have to bring these calls to a close. That was my attempt at a segue. I'm going with it. Yeah, so I think this was like yet another really exciting, kind of raising a lot of questions talk, and we've identified some future themes. And I maybe just to do a little bit of signposting of what's ahead, and for people who didn't join the call as early as I did for kicks, we kind of had 2 more themes already selected. They are privacy and justice. And we had some very minimal initial thoughts on readings, which I've gone back and extended. So at this point, I think we could go ahead with those unless other people have something they'd like to offer. Though in particular around privacy, I think if someone has like a really, maybe a hot take or a not, but a contemporary take from someone who's really active on a decentralization oriented project, I think that might help ground it a little bit, because the readings we have are quite theoretical. And I think there's been a nice balance when we have like concrete examples plus kind of people writing critically around these topics. And then for the justice one, we can really pull on some of the work that EDGI has been doing in the Environmental Data Justice Working Group, and I got some great recommendations, or pulled up the ones that I recalled us reading to sort of select down 1 or 2. Those are happening like in a month from now, monthly. I said that wrong. We have 1 in a month, 1 in another month. So there's a little bit more time. So the reading is a little bit more, as many of you are familiar with. Then after that, we recently had the Data Together annual meeting, and everyone was really jazzed about reading groups. And so we sort of said that we wanted to figure out a way to have this continue. I think our last reading group for this year is, or the last reading group that we have currently planned is the 30th of October. I suggested, but I'm open to other people wanting otherwise, that actually we maybe have a bit of a pause of like what worked, what didn't, kind of review the notes, look at all of these themes of future things we want to talk through that have come up over these last 4, and then maybe just rethink what the right process is if this becomes a little more of an ongoing reading group, because we sort of had an arc when we did this first one. So I think maybe we might have like a call in November, a quicker, not an hour and a half chat about that, to kind of like do some theme identification, and also do it asynchronously on the GitHub. So if you haven't found your way to it, if you go to github.com/datatogether/reading-datatogether, that almost rhymed, that was ridiculous. That would be where that conversations happen, but we'll also kind of send around a lot of reminders. That was my like major signposting. So basically, see you all in a month about a reading group. I'll send around that note, and I see a hand. So yeah, if anyone has any final thoughts, things on that we want to surface now, I'll hand it off to Matt Zed.
I just want to echo, I really look forward to doing a call where we just, well, retrospect on what worked and what we could improve, but particularly hashing through all these topics that that have bubbled up, and actually picking them and ordering them and figuring out who's going to set the syllabus, because we've just kicked up such great stuff. Also, there was some discussion last week about asking Marvin Amori, who's now general counsel at Protocol Labs, to do sort of a Q&A with this group after we've done the privacy and legal discussion. And his answer was, well, I don't feel like I'm up to date on these topics, but if you guys want to talk, I'm fine. So so we can set up a call with him, maybe as in this sort of aftermath, when we finish the formal setup, we can just do a more informal call with him.
That sounds so great. It's gonna happen. Cool, okay. And maybe also just a note, if people have, so we're sending the updates on Slack, but then we're also sending them to the Data Together group, like mailing list thing. So if people would like to receive them by email but haven't been, could you either, I'll stay on for a little bit, you can send me your email on this thing or drop it in the chat and I'll redact it when it goes on the website. and or in Slack, just let me know. Because I just realized that not everyone is getting the reminders by email, but we've also been doing the reminder in the Slack channel. Okay, cool. I'm going to stop recording now.